everybody can see those. We're going to talk today about what a lot of you will have already seen in the news coming, which is the proposed changes to employment law. For those of you that have worked in sort of in the employment law, HR space for a while, it is an area of law that is quite political in many respects. So when we have a Labour government, we tend to see more of a shift towards enhanced rights for workers, trade unions and so on. And when we have Conservative government, we tend to move back to away from those rights, perhaps to less power for the trade unions and to more power for employers. So as we move forward into the Labour government era over the next few years, they have already set out their stall very clearly in the Labour manifesto, which was set out in the King's speech on the 17th of July, which I'm sure some of you will have already therefore picked up on. But just to kind of recap on what they are proposing, it's actually really potentially very radical for employers. And so there'll be a lot for particularly for HR teams and for managers to get to grips with, and potentially fairly quickly, because one of the things that they've been keen to press is that this needs to be done quickly. It's not a long-term aim. It's something that they see as part of their core plan to, as they put it, make work pay. So the manifesto and the plan to make work pay, so it's the core part of their mission, and it's the stated aim is to make work more family friendly, improve living standards, put more money in working people's pockets, boost economic growth, resilience, and so on, and conditions. So all very laudable aims. Whether it will achieve it, I think only time will tell. But these are what I'm going to set out now is what Labour feels is going to achieve those aims. One of the things that have already started, though, is that they have proposed much stronger trade union collective bargaining rights and a greater working with them. There was actually a meeting on the 14th of August between some of the key trade unions and the government, and it was suggested that that should be a sort of wipe the slate clean meeting, a reset on what has been quite a difficult time between the government and unions over the last few years. I think local government not quite so much in the focus in terms of the pay issues, but you will have seen or even possibly experienced, if you've been waiting for health treatment or have a family member waiting for health treatment, a very large impact in the health sector, which Capsticks also do a lot of work in that space. And we've been supporting at the national level on those issues. But already we've seen the nursing union, which is one of the biggest unions, nurses making up one of the largest sections of the NHS workforce, as you'd expect, have already rejected the 5.5% pay offer on an extremely large mandate. I think it's about 2/3, a larger mandate than, in fact, they had for their strikes a couple of years ago. So we can see that whilst, the aspiration is for stronger trade unions and links and for better relationships with unions, ultimately, I think, if they can't match that with a pay deal that the unions feel is appropriate for their members, whether that will be an achievable thing will remain to see. And the difficult position that they have is, obviously, you will have seen in the news the junior doctor strikes, which we've done a lot of work on. And they resolved that by a very significant pay offer. But obviously, as was entirely expected, and I'm sure there are some things in the background we haven't seen yet, but inevitably, when you award one section of the workforce, a particular pay rise, then another section of the workforce is going to say, well, why can't I have the same percentage? So I'm not sure that the NHS strikes are over, and I wonder if it will start to ripple out into other areas. Obviously, we saw quite a lot of discontent in the teaching areas, for example, which will be more relevant to local government. But, pressure on the NHS necessarily ripples out into social care too. So I think potentially the NHS, further NHS strikes could be on the horizon among the doctor cohorts, but we will have to see how Labour proposes to address that. We don't have the Employment Rights Bill published yet. That's what they said they would do within the first 100 days. And by my counts, that would be by October. So we've got a few days left. It'll obviously be just my luck that it comes out later today or tomorrow when we've already done this talk. But just to say, later in the year, once we do have the bill, we will be doing some roundtables with PPMA to look in more detail at certain aspects of the bill that are going to result in really significant changes. So we will pick up that as well, and there'll be a further opportunity to look at it. But what are they proposing? I mean, effectively, it's supposed to put into effect what they said back in their manifesto and back in the King's speech. But the main headlines, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail as we go along in the session, are day one rights. The big one being unfair dismissal. So as you'll know at the moment as HR practitioners, if you take on a new member of staff, they have to wait 2 years to claim unfair dismissal in the ordinary sense. Obviously, there's a day one right to claim discriminatory or whistleblowing dismissal, but the 2-year period was said to allow employers to assess whether that person was suitable for the role. They're saying that no, we won't have that period anymore, although they've caveated it with a suggestion of a possible probation process, which I'll come back to a little bit later. Also, day one rights to parental leave and sick pay instead of having to wait the current minimum periods. They said ensure the minimum wage is a genuine living wage. One of the particular points is remove what they see as the discriminatory age bands so that all adults are entitled to the same minimum wage. Now, in the public sector, the minimum and the genuine living wage generally don't come up that often because your pay scales are set to be at or above what's considered to be a living wage. But obviously for some quarters or for where you work with partner organisations, such as if you work with external care homes, for example, that have lots of staff on minimum wage or genuine living wage, then you might expect that when you start to negotiate for places in care homes or for children in supported living and so on, that you might find that those private entities start increasing their costs to cover the increased pay bill. There's going to be a new fair pay agreement in the adult social sector. Again, we haven't really had any detail about what that would mean, but clearly for local government, the social care sector has been a really difficult one for an extremely long time. I don't think any government has successfully resolved the really difficult question of what to do about an ageing population that increasingly needs more and more help towards the end of their life, and it's increasingly more expensive in the context of fewer people being willing to work in those roles. I'm sure many people find it a rewarding role, but a difficult one, often with shift work, often working with people who may exhibit difficult behaviours and so on. So attracting good quality people to those sectors has been difficult for a while. And the hope is that the Fair Pay Agreement will recognise the key role that people working in the social care sector, in adult social care, play in our society, looking after our most vulnerable. What that Fair Pay Agreement will look like, I'm not sure. There have been various kind of floating that it should mirror sort of the band 3 pay in the NHS. So why would you get less pay to be a care worker than you would get to be a support worker in a hospital, for example, if you're doing a similar job in someone's home? So there's been a sort of some talk around whether that might be the yardstick of what a fair pay agreement would look like. But ultimately, we're waiting on the detail for that. The dismissal and re-engagement, fire and rehire. When there is genuinely no alternative, businesses will be able to restructure to remain viable, but they must follow a proper process. a little bit vague. You'll recall, for some of you will recall rather, that earlier in the year, on the 18th of July, the statutory code of practice on what they call fire and rehire came into effect. Whether that's going to stay around for very long, we'll have to see, because obviously if they bring in new statutory provisions that potentially prohibit fire and rehire, then that code will become obsolete. Again, some of this, this would be, I'd say, one area of change that's perhaps not as greater impact on local government, but one to watch. Where did it come from? So you may remember a few years ago, there was one of the large shipping companies effectively dismissed its entire seagoing workforce, offered them much reduced pay and terms and conditions. And when they wouldn't agree, they then took on workers based in other jurisdictions and agency workers, effectively leaving large numbers of people without a job. They ended up having to reverse that, I think, through pressure from the government and publicity, and they accepted afterwards it hadn't been done in the proper way. Now, obviously, in the sectors in which local government works, there isn't this other pool of workforce to dismiss the ones you've got and go and get some more people. So, a bit like the NHS, a bit like fire and so on, there isn't a workforce of social workers elsewhere that you could fire and rehire a new set of people. So, I don't think that the sort of dismissal and re-engagement piece has quite such a place in public services. The other thing as well is that clearly you're not going to dismiss all your frontline service, because what if they won't agree to be re-engaged and you then have no one to do the job? So there's much more risk, I think, attached to these sorts of processes in a public sector context, which is why they're used very sparingly, if at all. The only time that I do see these particularly used are, where people want to change working patterns. So I have seen this used quite effectively where employers want to move from a, say, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday plan to a 24/7 or something like that work plan, and where people are unwilling to agree the shift pattern, that they effectively dismiss and offer the new terms, which would be the new shift pattern, and then they take it or they don't. And if they won't take it, then they would stand dismissed and the employer would employ someone else. And obviously that person would have a right to bring a claim if they wanted to challenge that. But in principle, if done properly, that can be a fair reason to dismiss. At the moment, if the government does go ahead with a complete prohibition on fire and rehire for business restructures, other than where the restructure is needed to keep a business viable, I'm not sure whether those working hours restructures sort of processes would necessarily work. It would be difficult to show, I think, unless you're in such a financial challenge, such as some of the councils we've seen over the last year or so issuing their statutory notices, to show that the changes were needed to avoid effectively bankruptcy. That would be quite an extreme position to take. Whether the government will allow exceptions for anything else, remain to be seen. So that will be tricky, I think, to navigate changing wholesale terms and conditions if they do go ahead as is suggested. But as I say, in the context of public sector norms, the sort of the fire and rehire piece doesn't really have a central place in our experience. And the last bit then, that they're looking at strengthening protection for whistleblowers, and in particular on sexual harassment, which I'll come back to in a moment. One of the interesting things as well is there's a proposal that grievances can be raised collectively with ACAS. So at the moment, it is possible to ask ACAS to come and adjudicate on a collective grievance between trade unions and an employer. So I've assisted on various sort of processes like that with the assistance of ACAS to find a way through where an employer wanted to make changes. For example, I did one where an employer used to run a bus service between its various places of work that was free for employees. But over time, with the advent of home working, with electric bikes and a bike scheme they'd introduced an electric car scheme and car sharing initiatives and other forms of transport, and also just reorganized how they worked. The actual number of people that were using the hopper was really very low, and actually it would have been cheaper to just pay for taxis. So it would, the bus was costing, I think, something like £250,000 a year to run for about 5 people a day using it. So they wanted to remove it, but the unions were very unhappy because, as you'd expect, those that were continuing to use it tended to be those on lower pay. So we used ACAS effectively to mediate an agreement there around how the bus service would be withdrawn and what it would be replaced with. So it is already possible to use ACAS effectively, and they do have some really good mediators there that can help achieve an outcome. So would, if you do have a very large sort of issue, collective grievance around pay conditions that you think it would be useful to have an external person come in, ACAS does have a place there, and it's generally free. So very useful in that regard too. But what this would allow is that rather than it being an agreement to invite ACAS in between employees, trade unions and the employer, that the employees would be able to just raise their grievance with ACAS, and then ACAS would be able to get involved at that point. How far it could be made mandatory remains to be seen. Ultimately, mediation has to always have an element of voluntary participation, because and you can require someone to come and sit in a room, but you can't require them to agree. And just like you can't make someone say sorry. I mean, you can tell them to say sorry, but you can't make them mean it. And whether you can actually force an individual to say sorry at all, I think is probably, as adults, not. But in other jurisdictions, such as Australia, there is a requirement for meaningful participation in mediation for workplace disputes, particularly to avoid strikes. And the equivalent of ACAS in those jurisdictions has a much broader and stronger role to play in trying to avoid protracted issues that ultimately result in industrial action. And we will have seen, not just in public services proper, but also in sort of the private public space. And I'm thinking particularly of train companies. I'm sure everybody on this call at some point or other in the last few years has experienced issues due to the train strikes, be it your train not turning up or a busier commute because everybody's got in their car because the trains are cancelled. And it'll be things like that I think that ACAS may have a stronger role to play. But we will have to see to what extent it is mandatory, and if it's not, how effective it's going to be. But to watch out for, obviously, that if that does come through and ACAS does notify you that they've got a collective grievance, is having the right framework and resources available to deploy to deal with it. Because obviously ACAS, it may be that it's mandatory and you'll need to make sure you comply with any requirements set out. Another interesting feature, and I say interesting, as a lawyer I find it interesting, hopefully as HR practitioners you do as well, but law can be a dry area to those that don't necessarily have the interest in it. But the move to the single status of worker, I think this is going to be another really interesting area. You will have seen, again, I'm sure, as HR practitioners and managers and so on, over the last probably 7 or 8 years now, there's been a very large number of cases about who's employed, who's a worker, who's self-employed. And again, a lot of these cases come out of what we call the gig economy, or the economy, the section of our workforce where people don't actually have a lot of choices. So those that work for Uber, those that work for, all of the other, I'm picking on Uber, but that's just one of the cases, Deliveroo, those kinds of on-demand services. But for a lot of those people, English may not be their first language. They may lack qualifications. They may have just arrived in this country, fleeing war or whatever, and that may be the only job for the moment that they can get. Or it may be an extra way to earn money around another job, or around childcare, or around other commitments, and so on. But generally speaking, the kinds of people that the court says works in those kinds of areas lack any real ability to negotiate the terms of their employment. It's not like a senior manager coming in, or even potentially senior nurse or social worker that might come in and say, well, I'd like a job with you, but I have childcare commitments, so I need Fridays off, or they have obviously in public sector bodies the ability to negotiate different pay isn't really there because of the way pay structures work. But your ability to talk about what you want to do in your role, what days you want to work, your hours, who you're going to work for, the geographic area you're going to cover, those kinds of things, we would absolutely expect employees to be able to have proper conversation with their employer to work out what's a good fit for everybody. But in those sort of very transient jobs where, if they don't want the terms offered, someone else will just do the work. They don't have a lot of bargaining power. So a lot of the cases that have come up about protections for workers are born out of that recognition that there can be quite a degree of exploitation of those people that lack choices. But what happens is you legislate in one area, and obviously the ripple out of the principles come into the other areas. So you will have seen, for example, things about holiday pay and so on, rippling out into the public sector about how much you need to pay when people take annual leave, and some of that comes from those kinds of cases. Moving to a sort of single status of worker is going to be an interesting one, because effectively, it could potentially mean that either you're employed, as we would know it now, in which case you'd have the full suite of rights to maternity pay, to claim unfair dismissal, to everything, or you're genuinely self-employed, and there's no middle, which we have at the moment, which is that of worker. Will that suit everybody? I don't know. Some people like the flexibility of bank work. In particular, we see a lot of people towards the end of their career like the flexibility that bank work brings, for example, or agency work, or however you run your temporary staffing. They don't want to work week in, week out. They want to take 6 weeks off over summer, or grandchildren or whatever. Lots of my clients in particular have lots of people that retire and then work on a temporary basis for them. They wouldn't really want to be employed. So it remains to be seen how you balance protection of people who lack choices in the work that they take and are, genuinely vulnerable to exploitation, and how you balance that with a degree of flexibility for those that choose that knowingly, and that's what they want. And also for employers, having a degree of flexibility in their workforce is important to manage peaks and troughs. But that'd be an interesting one. Employment status has been a hotly contested area for years now. So if we rip up the rule book and move to something completely different, will it result in another 7 or 8 years of litigation about that? Maybe. We'll have to see how they propose to do that. Other bits then that we're looking at, equality at work. So trade union representatives will have a greater position in the Equality Act. Quality impact assessments will be strengthened for public sector bodies, although they don't have the detail on what they mean by that. I mean, I would say from my own perspective, the equality impact assessment can be a really useful tool for defending claims where you want to make changes in your workforce. So, or where you want to make a decision which may be subject to challenge. So for example, one of the pieces that I worked on is one of my clients wanted to engage a Catholic chaplain for their, this is in a hospital setting, for their patients, because actually when they'd done their sort of assessment of who asked for pastoral support, they were unable to provide a Catholic chaplain effectively, and that was the most commonly requested form of support. So they wanted to go out for advert for Catholic chaplain, and that would necessarily mean that they're going to be male, because the Catholic faith, as far as I understand it, still does not allow women to be priests, and couldn't be married, because again they can't be priests can't be married, and obviously of the Catholic faith. So you're already excluding very large sections of society from applying for that role. So inherently there's an equality impact on that. But what we did is a very extensive impact assessment on why it is that we needed them to be Catholic, based on the data, based on the request, and what was it about being a Catholic priest that was important for the role. And one of the particular issues in the hospital was people would ask for the last rites, as you'd expect in hospital. Unfortunately, that is something that is asked for every day. And only a Catholic priest can deliver the last rites to somebody who's Catholic. You can't get somebody else to do it effectively. It's not the same thing. So in fact, what we were able to show through the impact assessment in advance of putting out the advert is that that was why it was necessary to make that decision in that way. And we were challenged by a variety of sources, both religious and non-religious bodies, that pushed about why the hospital would pay for a Catholic chaplain and wouldn't then pay for a whole range of other people. I mean, it did have a range of other people in different areas as well, but why they wouldn't pay for even more support as well. But we were able to successfully defend a judicial review for that. So that was really useful. And having a equality impact assessment in advance shows that you've thought about it, you've got your evidence, and for your legitimate aim, what you're trying to achieve, if there is an impact on equality, it's always far easier to defend those decisions if you've got your impact assessment in advance than if you're trying to do it after the event to justify a decision that's already been made. So actually, I would say, the equality impact assessment, I would always recommend that you do those anyway for any changes that are likely to have an impact on particular sections of your workforce, regardless of whether it's required specifically by law or not. There'll be trade union involvement in an equal pay unit with an ability to enforce it. Again, I think slightly less relevant these days to public sector pay as it stands. Obviously, local government has had a very rocky ride historically with equal pay, as has many sections of the public sector. But that is one to watch as well. And pay gap reporting. So I'm sure all of you are already used to the gender pay gap reporting, but what's coming online will be ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting. In some ways, I think some of it will be trickier to report accurately because not everybody will want to, or you can't require someone to declare a disability and they may not want to. But that is coming. And then of interest in particular to local government, I think, is the enactment of the socio-economic duty under Section 1 of the Equality Act. So Section 1 of the Equality Act was written in, the bill came out in 2008, but so we're a very long period of time on from when the Equality Act came out, but Section 1 has still not been enacted. And what that requires public sector bodies to do is to take steps to eliminate discrimination and difference because of different social standings. So because of class, because of education, because of social and economic advantage or disadvantage. I think for local government that already work very hard, I think, in this space around worklessness, around youth employment and engagement and so on in their own local economy, and try and use their own buying power and their own services to further their own local economy. There is already a degree to which this is being done anyway, but perhaps not because it's a duty, but because more generally that's seen as a good thing for councils to be doing, and there are other duties placed on it in any event that kind of cross over with this socio-economic duty. But you could perhaps see some more challenges around that. And also in terms of your workforce, how do you ensure equality of opportunity? For example, recruitment from the traveller communities is often brought up as one area where there's not been great progress made. Recruitment from other areas of society as well. So that'll be one to watch. That's already set out in the Equality Act, so we know what's coming in respect of the duty. How that will, in fact, ripple out into what councils actually need to do, I think we'll need to see the guidance that comes with it, but an interesting one. And then the ending of one-sided flexibility. Again, I sort of mentioned this before about the gig economy, the ban exploitative 0 hours contracts. So that's the sort of the way that they're seen, and they can be exploitative. I don't think it's wrong to say that some employers use 0 hours contracts exploitatively. In particular, until a few years ago, it was possible not only to give somebody one of those kinds of contracts, but also to prohibit them from working elsewhere in the context of not having to give them any hours. So you could end up with people on a contract which was effectively useless to them because they weren't getting any hours from the employer, but they weren't allowed to work anywhere else. Absolutely, those kinds of arrangements can be exploitative, and necessarily that needs to be looked at. But there are other areas where people genuinely like the 0 hours contract because they like the ability to work particular hours one week and not the next, and not have the requirement to do or not do work when they don't want to. One of the things that they're looking to do, though, is to reflect the number of hours they regularly work on a 12-week reference period, and that they're entitled to ask for a contract for that. So I think in terms of for employers, it'll be looking at how much do you use 0 hours contracts, and is that still the right thing? Is a 0 hours contract still the right way to go? And if it is still what you need to do, managing it effectively so that if people do get the right to request predictable hours from the 12-week reference period, that's not going to cause a difficulty in terms of having to offer lots of people contracts for work which you now don't have. So it'll be about managing those effectively. I'm thinking in particular if you have particular peaks and troughs, so around winter pressures, for example, in the care sector, you might take more people, you might have more hours in winter time for people, supporting people coming out of hospital and that kind of thing. Or you might have more support, for example, in schools. There might be certain times of the year when you require more help in those than you do at other times of the year, and so it will be across a range of different services. But it's about managing those relationships effectively so that they work for, the employee and for yourself. Employees will be required to give reasonable notice of any change of shifts or working time, with compensation proportionate to the notice given. This again is effectively to stop people from being offered work and then having it taken away when they're relying on it. Again, I'm not sure that this is going to be such a tricky issue for public sector employers that, I would say on the whole, try and do the right thing for their staff. And, generally the issue is don't have enough staff rather than too many staff and taking work away. So I'm not sure we'll have the largest of the impacts, but nevertheless, one to watch. The family-friendly rights. The parental leave will become a day one right. And they're going to review the whole parental leave system in the first year. I think there's a sense that it's become a bit fragmented. So you have your maternity leave, you have adoption leave, shared parental leave, paternity leave. You have all these different kinds of leave. And would it be fairer, better, easier, better for families if we had a fresh look and streamlined it into one more coherent system? One thing that hasn't been floated, which is often given as a reason why women tend to continue to take the burden of childcare, is that paternity leave is still a very short period, only 2 weeks, as compared to maternity leave, which is obviously 52 weeks. And there is the option to take shared parental leave, but lots of women don't want to give up their maternity leave. They want their full 52 weeks as well. Plus, the end of maternity leave isn't paid. So it's whether they'll look at a longer period of paternity or equivalent shared adoption leave, or and so on. I don't know. They haven't particularly sent that up as an option, but many commentators would say that if you really want to address the gender pay gap, you have to address the reason that women tend to be the ones that bear the main responsibility for childcare in the first place, and a lot of that starts with the way that the whole system is set up to prefer the woman staying off to the man, or to prefer one adopter off to the other. So, but in particular, it's about the maternity leave provisions being effectively, for most families, the way it works is the man wouldn't be able to just take a year off and not have any money. You have to use the maternity pay that's there. So whether that would be something that they would bring in to make it a little longer, I don't know. But that would be something I think that might be looked at, and we might see coming down the track. Strengthening protections for pregnant women, making it lawful to dismiss a woman who's pregnant 6 months after return, except in specific circumstances. Again, I think in the public sector, I'd say, and I've done public sector work in a range of sectors, so local government, police, fire, health. I only do public sector work. I would say I don't think I've ever come across a very obvious case where somebody has been dismissed because they've taken maternity leave, or because they've got pregnant. There might have been perhaps not the best management practices of what someone's going to do while they're pregnant, or how they return to work, but not an intentional decision because of that. And generally, people don't get dismissed when they just come back from maternity leave, because employers, that I work for, that just wouldn't be a decision they tend to make. But it does happen in other areas. So again, I would say, obviously, as public sector employers, you'll need to be aware of that, and factor it in, particularly if you're doing restructures. But whether it will actually make an enormous difference to how you would operate as an employer wanting to be, a good employer, fair employer, and inclusive employer, I'm sure you're all very far on with your policies around that. I'm not sure it will make an enormous difference to approach in that regard. The other bit as well, which is interesting, is introducing the right to switch off. And obviously, as a lawyer, I'm quite interested in how that's going to work. I think I read somewhere that in Japan or something like that, I think it's Japan, they have the right to just turn off the employers just turn off their email systems at certain times of the week, and at weekends, so employees cannot work, which is a really interesting concept. Certainly a journey that we've had at Capsticks, I think, certainly since I joined, and I joined back well over a decade ago. It was really quite the norm on holiday to check your, even on your annual leave, to check in on your emails each morning and maybe just answer a couple. And that was kind of, that was just how it was. And it was how it was in the other firm that I worked for another firm previously. There was also a public sector focused firm. And, a lot of my friends in different areas of business and so on, that's just how it was. It was just the norm, really, to stay in touch. Whereas very much we've been on a journey over the last few years that's not usually a very healthy way to use annual leave. And actually, if you don't actually switch off, you're constantly thinking about work. You never really get a break, and it does impact on your family life. I'm sure everybody has had that moment of regret when they've just picked up their phone at sort of 8 o'clock at night because they saw it go, and they see an email come in that they weren't expecting or something like that, and you get that kind of bristle, and you're like, oh God, I wish I really hadn't looked at my emails. And I think it's that's trying to aim to help with how that will work in practice, whether it will require employers to wholesale turn off emails or so, and I don't know. I'm not sure as well in certain areas if your business if that's going to work. I mean, clearly, your out of hours social work team is not going to be able to just can't turn off the whole system. There'll be certain areas of your services that are 24/7, and there won't be a switch off. But be interesting to see how that would work in practice. And also, for some people, some people say to me, but I like to look at my emails because that helps me manage the stress of what what's going on. The unknown is what stresses me. So it's interesting whether this is the right to switch off, how that will apply. Whether it would be a universal thing or whether it be for employees rather, to request it. But an interesting one. Sexual harassment, strengthening the legal duty for employers to take all reasonable steps to stop sexual harassment before it starts. Then they haven't said that this is going to apply to third-party harassment. It will only apply to your own workforce. But an interesting one, and I think you will have seen the really difficult time that some other public services have had around sexual harassment. I think in particular, the police service, you will have seen all of the really difficult stuff coming out of the David Cousins stuff in the Met, and some other bits around the CPS and so on, some really difficult issues about sexual harassment in the workplace. Whether that will have an impact, we will have to see, but I think most people would agree, step in the right direction. Another interesting one, and again, I think a lot of my clients are quite on with the menopause action plan and recognising it as an issue that they need to grapple with, particularly with an ageing workforce. And if you look at the public sector as a whole, a very female-dominated workforce. I think in some areas of the public sector, women make up 70 to 80% of the workforce, if not more. So it's more than half of your workforce is going to go through menopause at some point. So what a menopause action plan will look like, we'll have to get some detail on that, but we will see. We will see as the guidance comes out. I mentioned before as well, and we are going to come back to some of these after the break, which is in about 10 minutes, to look at some of these and to have a chat about how you think it's going to, what the impact you think you'll have on your own workforce. But the trade union bill, so there was a minimum service level brought in. It never really came in because there's been so many challenges, and the option to bring in agency workers effectively to break strikes. For most of my clients, the idea of bringing in agency workers to cover strikes really just didn't really ever impact, because they run specialist services. If you're, excuse me, if your social workers or nurses or whoever go on strike, there isn't just this magic pool of people to go, okay, well, we'll just go to the agency and we'll get them to send us some people instead. There aren't the people there to cover necessarily the work. So, say if your refuse collectors go on strike, there isn't just this pool of people that will be able to, work, on a basic level, know how to work the refuse truck collection in a safe way, and comply with all of the health and safety that goes around the collection of refuse and the safe disposal of it. You can't just get somebody with a HGV license and say, have a go. There's a whole other level to it of skill, experience, and training that goes with the vast majority of frontline public service delivery. So I've never really thought that particularly had an impact on on the public service, public sector sort of employers generally. The minimum service potentially could have done. It's interesting, the trains, hospitals, schools and so on, in particular, obviously for local government schools, but they're proposing to repeal that. I mean, never really got going because of all of the challenges, but that's going to go. Electronic balloting, at the moment there isn't that, but that potentially would lead to higher turnout. New rights for trade unions and members to access workplaces. Again, we'd have to see the detail, what they mean by that. More rights and protections for trade union representatives. And interestingly, a new duty on employers to inform new employees of their right to join the union on a regular basis. I think lots of public sector employers do let people know about the unions that are available, and do have partnership agreements, and a lot of them have decent relationships with their unions, and actually unions can be enormously helpful in affecting change and so at times in some areas of the business, and helping with employee issues and supporting members through process and so on. So potentially not a big change for local government, but one obviously to bear in mind. A few bits on employment tribunals. For those that do the litigation, the tribunal's on a bit of a path to digitise at the moment, and it has been for a while. It's a little clunky. We're trying to get through it at the moment. But one of the big changes that might come is that they're going to increase the time limit to bring a claim to 6 months across the board, which would obviously mean that lots of claims that would currently be out of time will be brought in time. But we will see how that works in practice. For some people, it doesn't matter what the deadline is; they will always miss it. I've just seen in the chat somebody's asked about hybrid working. It's a really interesting one, because on the one hand, the government has talked very regularly about the need for hybrid working and flexibility and family friendly. And then on the other hand, you have senior politicians saying that the best place to be is in the office, and they'll be going 5 days. So a bit of a contrast there in what's said. I don't think there will be a specific piece that comes out about hybrid working. I think it will be left to employers to decide what's right for their workforce and how they manage it. I know a lot of my clients at the moment are really struggling still with the post-COVID reluctance to come back to work, as people have reorganized their lives, or perhaps still have health conditions that mean that they can't or are worried about working in the office. Lots of people, lots of my clients have found that their employees moved 4 hours away and now can't come to the office. So I don't think that there will be legislation, particularly in respect of hybrid working. I think it will be left to employers to deal with, and I appreciate that it continues to be a really difficult issue for many people. I'm happy to talk a bit more about hybrid working if it'd be an interest after the break. The safer workplaces bit, I don't know if people have seen anything around that. I mean, it's quite, it's sort of quite high level what they've said about it, which is supporting well-being of workers and their long-term physical health. I think this comes out of the statistics that say that I think there's 500,000 more people off work since COVID than previously because of ill health. So there's a huge portion of the workforce that is off sick, and they reckon it's going to cost £30 billion next year to support those workers in terms of benefits and other support, and really about how you get how you break that cycle, and some really interesting things about the anxiety and the worry for people that have been out of work for a really long time about how they'll cope going back to work, and actually their health condition itself perhaps isn't what is preventing them from coming back. Is their mental health and anxiety about how it might work that's preventing them coming back instead. So I think those safer workplaces and those initiatives around long-term physical and mental health, keeping people in work, trying to get people back to work, as said, they will be a focus. But again, the rising level of people off work because of health conditions, I don't think is an easy answer. I think the other bit as well is with the aging workforce and the continued increase in the pension age, necessarily potentially more people as they work for longer, work later, work until they're older, perhaps may start to experience health conditions whilst they're still classed as working age, whereas historically they would not have been classed as working age and so would have been out with these numbers. But we'll have to see how that pans out. I've talked about the sort of the pay gap, and it will enshrine equal pay for the global majority and for disabled people. I mean, I think equal pay, I think it is already there. I mean, you can't pay somebody less because of their skin color or because they're disabled. So what that will mean in practice, I'm not sure how that will necessarily change what the law is now. Perhaps there'll be greater focus on it. I think the issue will more be that in respect of disabled people, I would say, is not necessarily that they're paid less to do the same job. I think it's quite well established, and employers wouldn't be in doing that intentionally because they would know that would be an issue. I think the issue is how do you create equal opportunity for promotion and things like that. There's a sort of sometimes can be a bit of a sense of, well, I found you a job now that suits your adjustments, needs, and suits all of your health conditions, and so there you go. That's your job now for life, and don't revisit whether there's a promotion opportunity and things like that. So that's I think where the focus will be rather than per se equal pay. I think it's time for a break now. I'll start. I've just got one more bit when we come back to sort of talk to you about, which is the Hillsborough law, and then I was going to open it up to a bit of discussion about some of the topics I've covered, and if people had any initial thoughts, and I'm happy to pick back up on the hybrid working, because I know that's a tricky area.
Alessandra, that's been excellent. Thanks very much for that gallop through significant changes that are potentially happening and the changes that have happened already. Just before we break at 11, if you don't mind, there's a couple of hopefully quick questions and answers just in the chat. And
Yeah, sure.
one certainly related to Northern Ireland. I take it in terms of will tribunal changes apply to Northern Ireland? Not sure if you're aware of that or not.
So generally speaking, Northern Ireland is dealt with separately for tribunal purposes. So it would need to be subject to separate legislation, and generally speaking, it would be left to the Northern Ireland government to decide. But obviously, there tends to be parity, so I would anticipate significant pressure for similar provisions to be enacted. But it would have to be done separately. It wouldn't be England and Wales is one court structure and Northern Ireland is another. Same for Scotland, obviously. Do we expect changes in the ER bill to be made in April 25? I mean, yeah, I'm expecting when it comes out that the implementation date is going to be soon. But I would expect it to be phased in terms of what they see as their priorities to allow employers time to get ready. I think as well in terms of for those that do tribunal claims, and you will have seen perhaps there's quite a catalogue of things coming down the track, which I think will see claims be pushed up significantly. You know, greater rights, no unfair dismissal service, longer time limits in the tribunal, but ultimately the tribunal only has so many judges. They don't have enough at the moment, so it takes a really long time for stuff to come to the tribunal. They're not magically going to have another however many judges to deal with the cases. I think possibly what we will see is an even greater slowdown of things passing through the tribunal until sort of everybody catches up. So I think there'll be an opportunity for employers to catch up a bit because in reality there won't be this magic way to do it otherwise. But yeah, I'm expecting things like the gender, the ethnicity pay gap and the disability pay gap reporting to be, you know, next year you do your monitoring and then you report at the end of next year. I'm expecting it to be quite quick when it comes.
That's great, Alessandra. Thanks for that response as well.